as an economic entity, used to be up to par with the United States and bigger than China. Now, of course, it's a little bit smaller. So then the answer becomes that we kind of need to unite in this world, and I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, we don't. A lot of people don't understand that. I mean, I heard a really interesting way of saying it. You know, in Europe, we need to reform. So we have what we call the Draghi report, which is great. We have the Letta report. And I say this in the long term, and I'm not the one who decides, but I would like to see Ukraine both in the EU and in NATO. Why do I say this? I say it because if you look at things from the perspective of Putin, this operation has been a strategic failure on so many accounts. First of all, he wanted to take over Ukraine, but Ukraine became European and also transatlantic. Secondly, he wanted to prevent NATO from enlarging, and he ended up getting Finland and Sweden in, including doubling the border of NATO with his country in the form of Finland. Those are the moments when you need friends who have similar values, who have similar interests, and who have a similar capacity to project power. Mark and I have grown quite close over the years. We have a fairly similar background, albeit he's an economist, I'm a political scientist. And
you're better trained than he is. I say that as a political scientist.
I think that's a fight between Oxford and the London School of Economics, so that's sort of just one way of bilateral trying to understand what's going on in the world and how we can impact things. So we had a really nice 2-hour dinner tete-a-tete last night with Mark. But the other thing, the reason we're here is I have 40 companies in tow, from the defense industry, from tech, from mining, from the shipping industry, who have a vested interest to work together with our American friends. So it's kind of one of those moments when...
And Canadian ones too.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, the idea being that, we work together, Canada and Finland. And of course, then there was a little bit of hockey. And I have to congratulate Carleton University. I don't know which one stole the emblem of which one. That looks like Team Canada to me. And by the way, I'm not at all crossed at Connor McDavid's last-minute goal in the semifinals in the Olympics. And the penalty that he fished. But other than that, we're good. Other than that, I love Canada.
You've developed a very special relationship with Donald Trump. He's apparently very impressed with your golf game. And when you were talking to our Prime Minister, who's had a few difficult moments, did you suggest he might want to take up golf?
No, but we did keep our elbows down when we played hockey. So.
Well, turning to more serious matters.
You mean hockey is not serious? I'm worried here.
Mr. President, you're a student of history. And, if we go back to the ancient Greeks and Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian Wars, and for the benefit of students who did not do their reading for my final exam,
Here's the question.
Thucydides was not a Greek golfer. He was a historian who wrote about ancient Greece. And during a period of great power transition, as we saw in Greece, as we've seen really throughout history, small and middle powers, as our Prime Minister likes to say, end up being on the table as lunch, as opposed to setting the menu. So what hope do we have now, at a time of great power rivalry, that things are going to be different?
I actually think that we have a lot of hope. And when you speak about Thucydides, I always look at his trap. And his trap was the idea that when you're a great power in decline, you have to try to salvage what is left, and usually that is ending up in war. We could say that Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine is an example thereof. I think he was also right in saying that this is probably not directly from him, but from someone else, that I think we are between orders right now. You know, we know that the old world order, just like Mark Carney has said, is dead, but we don't know what the next one is going to be like. And then in foreign policy, you quite often have three instruments, and they're values, interests, and power. And us, the smaller guys, we have values. For us, they are liberal values, human rights, fundamental rights, democracy, freedom, the rule of law, international institutions. And then we have interests, and I think Canada and Finland, we connect with that. It's Arctic, it's defense, it's security, the rest of it. But we don't have power, unlike the big players. Now, how do we then project power? The way in which we do it is by coming up with ideas. So if the order is changing, try to take the agenda and suggest, okay, what is it going to be? Mark talks about middle powers. I talk about reforming the existing institutions. So I think we have a lot of agency as long as we take it. We just have to take the space of power that's given to us as small states, because otherwise we end up, you know, with what you refer to. It's sort of the big ones do what they want, and we small ones do what we can, and we have to try to avoid that.
If you look at the combined gross domestic product of Canada, Europe, Japan, Korea, we're actually bigger than the United States.
I think Finland plays a really big role in that one.
And we're bigger than China. We do have market power. We sometimes forget that the United States is heavily indebted to the rest of the world, and we are some of their principal creditors, some 21 trillion.
Yeah.
That should give us leverage, but the problem with small powers and middle powers, and we've seen this in the past year, is a classic collective action problem. Not being able to work together. And everybody thinking they can cut their own deal with whether it's Washington or Beijing. How do we overcome that?
Well, let me try to look at it from a slightly different angle, and this is probably where, you know, my thinking differs a little bit from Mark's, because he talks about middle powers. I talk about international institutions, and the reason I do that is Finland is a member of the European Union, and of course the European Union is not only an internal market, but it has exclusive competence on trade, competition, monetary policy, customs, and many other things. So I feel very well shielded in this different world. I know that, you know, if you read The Economist, they're not going to look at the EU as an entity, but the EU as an economic entity used to be up to par with the United States and bigger than China. Now, of course, it's a little bit smaller. So then the answer becomes that we kind of need to unite in this world, and I think that's what we're seeing. I mean, we don't. A lot of people don't understand that. I mean, I heard a really interesting way of saying it. You know, in Europe, we need to reform. So we have what we call the Draghi report, which is great. We have the Letta report. But you know, there are two things that are unifying Europe right now more than the Draghi report and the Letta report. One is security pressure coming from Russia. I've never seen us as united as we have been during this war. I mean, even Hungary now. And then pressure coming from the United States. So we're coming together. And my sort of thinking in all of this is, okay, how do we bring our values-based allies and friends together on this trip? Canada, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. And I think this will kind of happen, if not organically, at least quite naturally, that we start working together. That's why I'm sort of, you know, a little bit miffed. I should have called my book the rectangle of power instead of the triangle of power. But you know,
we actually have a copy here.
You can't have it all. You can't have it all.
Yeah. So, you know, speaking of Europe, and you mentioned Ukraine earlier, putting the U.S. aside, what's Europe's vision for Ukraine? What do you want to see come out of this if and when that conflict ends? And from your country's perspective, what would a sustainable European-led security commitment to Ukraine look like with Canadian support?
Okay, I think there are a few quite big questions there. Let me make the first observation. Was it not for Ukraine, in other words, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden would not have joined NATO.
Right.
So I think we are indebted to them for the fact that they made us see the reality that we live next to an imperial power, and for us to survive we need protection from NATO. So if you were to ask me for a headline, what would I like to see for Ukraine? And I say this in the long term, and I'm not the one who decides, but I would like to see Ukraine both in the EU and in NATO. Why do I say this? I say it because if you look at things from the perspective of Putin, this operation has been a strategic failure on so many accounts. First of all, he wanted to take over Ukraine, but Ukraine became European and also transatlanticist. Secondly, he wanted to prevent NATO from enlarging, and he ended up getting Finland and Sweden in, including doubling the border of NATO with his country in the form of Finland, which obviously has a defense posture that has been built up ever since the Winter War and the War of Continuation to provide enough deterrence to disinvest Russia's interest in acquiring territory from Finland. And thirdly, he wanted to project Russian global power with his attack on Ukraine. And look at his global power in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Syria, in Iran. It's nowhere to be seen. Right. So in that sense, I think they have fundamentally failed in what they've done. And even if you look at it from a territorial perspective, during World War II, it took 4 years for the Soviet Union to march into Berlin. We're now 4 years into the active war, but actually 13 years or 12 years into the war itself, and they have not even gotten Pokrovsk yet. Right. That's less than 20% of Ukrainian territory. And now, interestingly enough, and sorry for making this long, but just to see how much of a better place Ukraine is in today than they were a year ago. In the past 4 months, and sorry for being morbid, and I know this is rough language, but in the past 4 months, Ukraine has killed or wounded between 30 to 35,000 Russian soldiers per month. They have done so 95% with drones at a ratio of 1 Ukrainian dead to 5 Russians dead. Russia is not de facto anymore acquiring territory. In the past year, in 2025, they acquired less than 1 percentage point of territory in Ukraine, with 400,000 Russian soldiers dead or wounded. So if you extrapolate that and understand that Russia is now advancing at 157 dead to a square kilometer, it would take between 1 to 2 years to acquire Donetsk at a cost of roughly 800,000 dead. So militarily, this is it's a failure for Russia. Now, do I take joy in this? Yes, I do. But that will not necessarily change the strategic thinking and aim of Putin. His aim is still to acquire all of Ukraine. The only thing that will change his mind is a risk to his own regime, and whether that happens from the inside or not, we don't know. Sorry for the long answer.
I'd like to turn to Europe and defense. The Wall Street Journal reported this morning that active discussions underway, you've been intimately involved in them, to develop Plan B if and when the President of the United States decides to either reposition or withdraw troops from Europe. Is it realistic to think now, given the fiscal pressures that European countries are under, including your own, high levels of debt, that they're going to be able to pull off what seems to be a very ambitious plan to develop the industrial base, develop a stronger European defense capability, as the French would like. The Germans seem to have changed their position. They're much more supportive of it, as we're reading. Is it going to happen?
I think I have to qualify what I say. Is that I think sometimes in public discourse we see foreign policy, security policy, or defense policy as binary, as black and white. I think the only thing that's binary is the line between war and peace. But even that, in today's hybrid warfare, is somehow blurred. So when we talk about burden shifting, for me, it does not mean American withdrawal from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But it means a shift of the burden, which, if you use it figuratively, in today's world is 60-40 US, Europe, and Canada, to 40-60, the other way around. And then you start looking at, okay, what does this mean? NATO's deterrence is based on 3 pillars, which are conventional forces, missiles, and nuclear deterrence. And I think what's going to happen is a shift in the conventional forces, which I actually think is called for. So say hypothetically that there's roughly 100,000 American troops. You read the National Defense Strategy of the US and you see that they're going to reduce that number. But as long as that reduction happens in a controlled manner, in a cool, calm, and collected manner, in a planned manner, I think it's okay. We need to increase our own defense expenditure. We need to increase our capabilities. But then we come to missiles and perhaps other capabilities that Europe doesn't have. And I don't want to see those pulled out from Europe on the American side, which might have to do with air defenses, which might have to do with other types of capabilities. And then finally, and I don't think anyone in the US would suggest this, that there would be a withdrawal of the nuclear umbrella. And I keep on, when I discuss with my American friends and with President Trump, I tell them the raw fact that when you look at Arctic security, Finland has trained 1 million men and women through obligatory military service and conscription to fight in Arctic conditions. And our border is 100 kilometers away from Murmansk and the Koala Peninsula, where they have nuclear heads, Russians, which are not pointed at Helsinki, Stockholm, or Oslo. They're pointed at New York and Washington, D.C. So then you have to ask yourself the legitimate, I think, military question: is it in the interest of the United States to withdraw from NATO if those nuclear warheads are pointed at them? My answer is no. So, a controlled shift, burden sharing. Fine. You talked about fiscal space. I'm in the lucky position that I only do foreign policy and I'm the commander-in-chief. I don't do money. So I leave that question to the government. We have the Minister of Economy here, so he can probably answer that question. But of course, there's going to be pressure on a lot of European states. But give credit also to President Trump in the sense that with his innovative negotiating tactics, he did drive a lot of NATO member states to commit to 5% of defense expenditure. It's not going to be easy for European countries. It's not going to be easy for Canada, but it's something that has to be done in the name of our own security.
And do you think we'll ever reach 5% of GDP? Because in the Canadian case, if you crank the numbers, 5% of gross domestic product is more than the federal government transfers to the provinces in equalization payments, in social benefits. It's much bigger than the price of Medicare. Canada's going to be at a reckoning point. Do we want a national security state, which means dismantling part of the welfare state? And everything that I see in terms of the discussions in Europe, the discussions in France, they're almost already at that position.
Obviously, it's always a balance, but sometimes I feel, and also as former finance minister that this is not a straightforward accounting exercise between welfare and security. It's probably somewhere in between. And of course, during the Cold War, many European states had defense budgets which were north of 5% of GDP. It's a big ask, I fully admit that. It's not going to be easy, and every country has to find the right balance. The only worry I have is that, you know, a country like Finland, which is in the front line, together with the Baltic states, with Poland, obviously with Ukraine and Turkey, that we are not left to carry the burden ourselves, and that we all have to work on this together. So I think the trajectory is the right one in a very difficult situation of constrained fiscal space. Obviously, I'm not going to, you know, take issue with the way in which you distribute wealth to the provinces or the way in which you run your healthcare system. But just a gentle reminder, without security, there is no welfare state.
True. I'd like to turn to the issue of defense procurement. I couldn't help noticing that Finland is going to be buying, or is buying, F-35A fighters, some 64 of them. You have a neighbor, if I'm not mistaken, that makes a pretty good fighter called the Gripen. Maybe you could give us a sense of, you know, why you decided to go American as opposed to friendly Swedes.
Well, at the time of the decision, I was in academia, so you're going to have to ask the government who was in power at the time. No, I think if you want to look at the roots of that decision, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War. Finland had limits to its sovereignty as a state during the Cold War because of the aftermath of World War II. And then when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a debate began. Should we join the European Union or not? The answer to it was yes. And we didn't join the EU for economic reasons. We joined it for security reasons. That was the philosophy of trying to integrate into Western institutions as much as you can. But the time wasn't right to join NATO. Unfortunately, I was, you know, one of the few that supported Finnish NATO membership. So therefore, a decision was taken by our military authorities, actually, which I think, with the wisdom of hindsight, was brilliant, to say, let's integrate as closely as possible to the American defense industry and American defense, that when push comes to shove, were we to have to join NATO, we would be more NATO compatible than the NATO member states themselves. So we bought F-18s. And then a decision was made in 2020, early 2020s, late 2010s, that we needed to modernize our air defense. And then, of course, the military made its assessment, the political decision makers made their assessment, and ended up with the F-35s, considered to be the best on the market. And I think, even with the wisdom of hindsight, the decision was correct. Because on top of that, if you look at our long-range missiles, air, land and sea, if you look at a lot of the defense components that we have right now, many of them are linked to the American system. Now you might come back and say, okay, is there a kill switch? You know, what are the Americans going to do? Do you rely on them? Again, I come back to the notion that it's very much in the self-interest of the United States to make sure that Finland takes care of its backyard right in there next to the Koala Peninsula. So I think the decision was correct. But now, of course, again, we have to understand that things like air defense are changing. We're looking at what Ukraine is doing with drones, with missiles. So we're going to have to, I think, diversify even more than we expected. And the final point, which I should have said earlier, that Ukraine is not only doing better on the battlefield, and in that sense, you know, not losing the war, but I think we're coming to a point where Europe, the West, the United States, the Gulf states, they need Ukraine more than Ukraine needs us. And that's good to keep in mind.